Pack your bags or get a job, my family told me on Mother's Day. No one raised their voice. No one looked angry. The words were said calmly, almost politely, as if they were discussing the weather or what to have for dessert. My daughter-in-law said it first, her tone light, rehearsed. My son didn't interrupt her. He didn't correct her either. He just nodded, staring down at his plate. I didn't answer. I stood there at the end of the dining table, my hands resting on the back of the chair I had set for myself that morning. The table was laid with care, cloth napkins, the good plates, a small vase of grocery store carnations I'd bought with my own cash because it felt wrong to let Mother's Day pass like any other Sunday. The food was still warm. The roast I'd cooked for 3 hours. Mashed potatoes whipped smooth, just the way my son liked them when he was little. Gravy in the old ceramic boat with a chip on the spout. I had raised him on meals like this. I picked up my fork, then set it back down. My appetite was gone, but not in a dramatic way. It simply wasn't there anymore. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I didn't think my story mattered anymore, but I've learned that silence has weight. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Loud. Each second sounded heavier than the last. No one filled the quiet. My daughter-in-law adjusted her napkin. My son took a sip of water. I looked at the card they had given me. Pink envelope, generic flowers on the front, no handwriting inside, just printed words, Happy Mother's Day. I folded it once, then again, carefully, as if it were something fragile. I had been a mother for over 40 years. I'd worked 2 jobs when my husband was laid off. I'd skipped new coats so my son could have braces. I'd babysat for free, week after week, so they could get ahead. I never called it sacrifice. It was just what you did for family. But sitting there, hearing those words, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't being asked to contribute. I was being dismissed. Pack your bags or get a job. At my age, on Mother's Day, I pushed my chair in quietly. The legs didn't scrape the floor. I made sure of that. I didn't want to give them anything sharp to remember me by. I'll clean up, my daughter-in-law said quickly, already reaching for her phone. I nodded once, more out of habit than agreement, and walked down the hallway to my room. The hallway felt longer than usual. The family photos lining the walls watched me pass. Birthday parties, school plays. One photo of me holding my son on my hip, both of us smiling at the camera, unaware of how time rearranges loyalties. Inside my room, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The house was quiet again, the way it had been since my husband passed. Quiet had become familiar, but this was different. This silence wasn't grief. It was clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't call anyone. I took off my shoes and placed them neatly by the door. They thought the conversation was over. They thought they had drawn a line. They didn't know I had been standing on the other side of it for a long time already. The house felt different the next morning. Not emptier. Just quieter in a way that pressed against my ears. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every small sound, the refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on and off, the faint creak of the floorboards as the house settled. I woke up early, the way I always had. Habit doesn't disappear just because your place in the family does. I made my bed, smoothing the blanket flat. I folded my nightgown and set it on the chair, everything neat, everything in order. In the kitchen, the table was already cleared. The vase of carnations was gone. The card, too. The plates had been washed and stacked as if the day before had never happened. Mother's Day had passed quietly in the night, like it had never belonged to me. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat alone at the table. No one joined me. No one asked if I'd slept well. The chair my son usually sat in stayed empty, pushed in neatly. The silence wasn't awkward for them. It was only loud for me. I stared at the spot where I had stood the night before, hands on the back of the chair, listening to my future being discussed in a sentence. Pack your bags or get a job. The words hadn't followed me into sleep, but they were waiting when I woke up. I didn't feel angry. Anger requires energy, and I felt strangely calm. It was the calm that comes when something finally stops pretending to be something else, when a question gets answered without anyone meaning to answer it. I washed my mug and placed it upside down on the towel. Slowly, carefully. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. The house used to feel like ours. Then it felt like theirs. That morning it felt like I was a guest who had overstayed without realizing it. I went back to my room and opened the closet. My clothes hung in neat rows. Practical dresses, cardigans, shoes worn but clean. I noticed how little space I actually took up. One side of the closet was mine. The rest had quietly been repurposed months ago. I remembered when my son was young, how he used to leave his shoes in the middle of the floor. I'd trip over them in the dark and sigh, then pick them up anyway. Back then, being needed felt permanent. Now, being unnecessary felt efficient. I sat on the bed and listened. From down the hall, I could hear my daughter-in-law on a phone call, laughing softly. The sound didn't reach me fully, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone in the house, only alone in my place within it. I looked around the room. The framed photo of my husband on the dresser. His watch, still in the drawer where I'd placed it after the funeral. This room was the last space that hadn't been negotiated yet. After he died, things had shifted quickly. Conversations stopped, including me. Decisions were made without asking. Bills were handled. Papers were taken care of. I'd told myself it was temporary. That grief made people awkward, that families regroup, but grief doesn't tell you to pack your bags. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. No tears came. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. What I felt wasn't sadness, it was recognition. I had crossed into a new role without ceremony. Not mother, not matriarch, not even inconvenience, just something to be managed. Downstairs, a door closed. Footsteps moved through the house with confidence, not hesitation. The day had started for them. For me, it had already changed. I sat up, smoothed my skirt, and reached for my purse. Not to leave, just to remind myself that I still knew where my things were. And that mattered more than they realized. By the third day, I stopped pretending things would return to normal, not because anyone said anything else to me. No new arguments, no raised voices, just small changes that stacked quietly, one on top of another, until they formed something solid enough to block me out. It started with the mornings. I would come into the kitchen at my usual time, and the coffee pot would already be empty. Not dirty, clean, put away, as if someone had made a point of finishing it and resetting the space before I arrived. Breakfast conversations ended when I entered the room. Not abruptly, just gently, like a door closing without a sound. My daughter-in-law began calling me by my first name. Not mom, not even out of affection, just my name. Flat, efficient. The way you address someone you're coordinating with, not someone you belong to. My son followed her lead. He spoke to me less. When he did, it was logistical. Short sentences, neutral tone, as if emotion had become unnecessary between us. One afternoon, I noticed the hallway closet was locked. It hadn't been before. Inside were old documents, tax records, insurance papers, things my husband and I had always kept together. I stood there for a moment, keyless, staring at the knob. No one told me it had been locked. No one felt the need to. That evening, I heard them talking in the living room, not whispering, just assuming distance was enough. "She'll need something smaller," my daughter-in-law said. "Yes," my son replied, "something manageable." They were talking about space, storage, expenses. They were talking about me without using my name. I waited, listened. They didn't stop when I passed by the doorway. They didn't lower their voices. It wasn't secrecy. It was confidence. I realized then that decisions had been made long before Mother's Day. That conversation hadn't started anything. It had only confirmed it. Later, I went to check the mail. My name wasn't on it anymore. Just my son's. His wife's. Inside was a bank envelope, not addressed to me. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I recognized the logo. I had used that bank for years. I set the envelope back where I found it. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The walls knew the truth before I did. They had watched rooms change purpose, watched furniture get moved, watched my presence shrink without a single argument. I thought about my husband, about the way he used to say, "This is your home as much as mine." He had believed that was permanent. In the morning, I went through my dresser. Slowly, methodically. I wasn't packing. I was taking inventory. What was mine? What had quietly stopped being mine? What no one thought I would notice? In the bathroom, my things had been pushed to one side. New bottles took up space where mine used to sit. I picked up my toothbrush, rinsed it, and placed it back carefully. No one commented. By afternoon, I understood the new rule. I was allowed to exist as long as I didn't interfere, as long as I stayed quiet, as long as I didn't remind anyone who I used to be. That was when something settled inside me. Not anger, not fear, awareness. They thought I was slow to catch on. They thought age had softened me into acceptance. They were wrong about that. I had raised a child. I had buried a husband. I had survived seasons where silence was heavier than noise. This was not the first time I had been underestimated. I closed my bedroom door that evening and sat on the edge of the bed, not to rest, to think. And for the first time since Mother's Day, I didn't feel lost. I felt alert. That night, I took out the box I hadn't opened since the funeral. It was tucked on the top shelf of the closet, behind sweaters I no longer wore. The box was light, but I lifted it carefully, as if weight still mattered. Inside were papers my husband had kept in his handwriting, folders labeled in blue ink, envelopes folded flat, edges worn. He had always been meticulous, not controlling, just precise. He believed order protected people. I sat on the bed and opened the first folder, our marriage certificate, yellowed slightly at the corners, 42 years reduced to one page and a seal. I traced his name with my finger, slowly, remembering how steady his hands used to be, even toward the end. In another envelope, I found notes, short ones, the kind he wrote when he didn't want to forget something important. Make sure she's secure. House stays hers. Don't let them rush her. He had written those after his diagnosis. I remembered the night. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd been told to pack my bags. He'd reached across, covered my hand with his, and said, "I won't be here forever, but this is still your home." I believed him. I believed words carried forward. I closed the folder and leaned back against the headboard. The house was quiet again, but now it sounded different. Less hollow, more intentional. After he died, everyone had been gentle. Too gentle. They'd spoken softly, moved quickly, handled things for me. I had thanked them. I had let them. Grief had made me agreeable. I remembered how quickly that tone had changed, how condolences had turned into suggestions, how help had turned into oversight, how decisions had been framed as necessities instead of choices. I thought back to the first time I noticed it. A week after the funeral, my daughter-in-law had suggested rearranging the living room. "It'll be easier for you," she said. I watched as familiar furniture was shifted, then replaced. My chair moved to the corner. Her choices took center space. Then the paperwork. "I'll take care of it," she'd said more than once. Insurance, utilities, accounts. I had nodded, exhausted. I didn't realize how quickly taking care could become taking over. I reached for another folder, property tax statements. The last one addressed to my husband, the next addressed to my son. I hadn't noticed the change before. I noticed it now. I sat very still. No panic, just attention. It wasn't betrayal that hurt the most. It was the assumption that I wouldn't understand, that age had dimmed my awareness, that grief had erased my memory. They thought my silence meant confusion. It didn't. It meant patience. I placed the papers back in the box, one by one. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the need to confront anyone. Confrontation was loud. What I needed was clarity. The next morning, I watched my son leave for work from the window. He didn't look back. He didn't wave the way he used to when he was younger. He walked with purpose, confident in the direction of his life. He believed things were settled. After the door closed, I went to the kitchen and sat at the table. Sunlight fell across the surface where my husband and I had shared breakfast for decades. I rested my hands flat on the wood. This house had heard every version of me. The young wife, the tired mother, the grieving widow. They thought I was finished becoming. They were mistaken. I stood, returned the box to the closet, and shut the door gently. Not to hide the past, to protect it. And as I did, something firm took shape inside me. I wasn't ready to speak yet, but I was done being invisible. By the end of the week, someone new began speaking to me with honesty. Her name was Margaret. She lived 3 houses down and had known me for years, though we had never been close. Friendly waves, brief conversations by the mailbox. Nothing more. But that afternoon, she knocked on my door and didn't smile when I answered. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit right away. She stood in the living room, looking around as if she were taking note of changes she hadn't been invited to comment on. Then she turned to me. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," she began, "but I'd want someone to tell me." I waited. "I ran into your daughter-in-law at the bank," she said, "a few days ago." I didn't ask which bank. I already knew. Margaret lowered her voice. She was asking questions about transferring things, about timing. Things, I repeated. Yes, she said carefully. Not small things. I nodded once. Margaret finally sat down, hands folded in her lap. She assumed I knew you were moving, that it was already decided. The room stayed quiet. I thought about the locked closet, the missing mail, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way plans had been made with confidence, not concern. I didn't correct her, Margaret continued. I just listened. That was wise, I said. She looked at me then, really looked, as if she had expected tears or disbelief. She didn't find either. They're planning ahead, she said. Very far ahead. I know, I replied. Margaret exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. She didn't mean sorry for the situation. She meant sorry she had waited to speak. After she left, I sat alone in the living room and let the information settle. It didn't land like a shock. It fit too neatly with everything else. That evening, my son came home later than usual. He avoided the living room and went straight to the kitchen. I heard cabinets open and close. I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, low and efficient. I didn't join them. Instead, I opened my checkbook. I hadn't used it in months. Everything had been handled. Autopay, online accounts, systems I wasn't included in anymore. I flipped through the pages slowly. My handwriting was still steady. I thought about all the times I had helped without question, covered gaps, paid deposits, written checks without keeping copies. I hadn't needed proof back then. Trust had been enough. Trust, I realized, had been a one-way arrangement. The next morning, I walked to the corner cafe. Alone. It was something I hadn't done in a while. My daughter-in-law usually insisted on driving me, on managing my errands. I ordered a small coffee and sat by the window. People passed outside, busy with their lives. No one knew who I was or what I had lost or what was being decided without me. It was freeing. I took out a small notebook from my purse and began writing things down. Not emotions, facts, dates, names, changes I had noticed. I wasn't building a case. I was rebuilding my awareness. When I returned home, my daughter-in-law asked where I had been. Out, I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You should tell us next time. I met her gaze calmly. Why? She paused, just for a second. That pause told me everything. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't replay conversations anymore. I didn't imagine different outcomes. I focused on what had been revealed. Not everyone who stands beside you is standing with you. Margaret hadn't owed me anything. Yet she had spoken. My family owed me everything, and had chosen silence. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. I wasn't angry. I was done assuming good intentions where there were none. And I knew, with certainty now, that the quiet phase was ending. Not with noise, with movement. The change didn't happen all at once. It began with small decisions that belonged only to me. The following morning, I woke before anyone else and dressed carefully. Not formally, just deliberately. A pressed blouse, clean shoes, the purse I used to carry everywhere before I was told I didn't need to anymore. I left the house without announcing it. No one stopped me. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that clears your head without asking permission. I walked 2 blocks before my knees reminded me I wasn't in a hurry. I slowed down. Time had stopped chasing me. That was something I hadn't noticed before. At the bus stop, I sat and waited. The bench was cold. The street quiet. When the bus arrived, I paid in cash. The driver nodded, uninterested in my story, and that suited me just fine. Downtown hadn't changed much. The same brick buildings, the same bank on the corner. I stood across the street from it for a moment, watching people go in and out with purpose. Then I crossed. Inside, the air smelled like carpet cleaner and paper. A young teller greeted me with a practiced smile. I'd like to speak to someone about my accounts, I said. She looked at her screen, then back at me. Are you on the account? I was, I replied, and I still am. That earned me a different look. Not suspicious, curious. I waited in a chair near the window, hands folded in my lap, watching the street outside. When the manager came out, he was polite, professional. He said my name carefully, as if testing whether it still fit. It did. We talked quietly, no accusations, no raised voices, just confirmations, names, dates, signatures. I listened more than I spoke. When he turned the screen toward me, I leaned forward. Some things were exactly as I remembered. Others were not. I thanked him when we were done. I didn't rush. I didn't linger either. On the way out, I stopped at the pharmacy and refilled a prescription I'd been stretching longer than I should have. I paid myself. No one questioned it. By the time I returned home, the house was active. My daughter-in-law was on the phone. My son was in the garage. No one asked where I'd been. No one commented on the time. That was fine. I went to my room and placed the papers I'd been given into the bottom of my purse, beneath a folded scarf. They weren't dramatic documents, just clear ones. Clarity is often quiet. That afternoon, I made soup, enough for myself. When my daughter-in-law noticed, she paused. "You didn't make much," she said. "I wasn't very hungry," I replied. It wasn't untrue. That evening, my son asked if I had any plans for the weekend. "Not yet," I said. He nodded, relieved, I realized. Relief had replaced affection a while ago. I hadn't named it before. Now I did. Later, in my room, I wrote in the notebook again, added details, confirmed what I now knew. I wasn't being pushed out suddenly. I was being phased out carefully. That meant they believed I wouldn't react until it was too late. They had mistaken quiet for confusion. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me. Each rotation steady. Predictable. I had lived a life built on routine. Now I was building something else. Not revenge. Not confrontation. Position. From that point on, I stopped asking questions aloud. I listened. I observed. I moved when it made sense to move. And for the first time since Mother's Day, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Not the ground beneath the house. My own. By the 7th day, they stopped pretending I was part of the conversation. It wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. I could feel it in the way schedules shifted without mentioning me, in the way plans were made in rooms I wasn't invited into anymore. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law stood in the kitchen with her laptop open, papers spread across the counter. She didn't close it when I walked in. She didn't need to. "I'll need your social security card," she said, not looking up, "and your birth certificate." "For what?" I asked. She hesitated just long enough to choose her words. "For your records. It's easier if we keep everything together." "We?" I nodded slowly. "I'll look for them." I didn't. Instead, I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the request echo until it settled into place. She wasn't asking. She was collecting. That evening, I heard the word facility for the first time. Not spoken to me, spoken around me. "It's not permanent," my son said, "just until she's settled." "Settled where?" He didn't say. "She won't manage alone forever," my daughter-in-law replied. "We have to be realistic." Realistic. As if love had been a temporary arrangement. I stayed where I was, out of sight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. They spoke freely now. They believed the hardest part had already passed. They were wrong. The next morning, I received a phone call. The number was unfamiliar. "Mrs. Harris?" A woman asked politely. "I'm calling from Silver Pines Assisted Living. We've been informed you may be interested in a short-term placement." I closed my eyes. "Informed by whom?" I asked. There was a pause. Papers shifting. "Your family," she said gently. "I see," I replied. She continued speaking, explaining options, availability, waiting lists. Her voice was calm, professional. She believed she was helping. I thanked her and ended the call. My hands didn't shake. That was the moment everything became clear. Not suspected, not implied, confirmed. I wasn't being encouraged to be independent. I was being relocated. I stood and went to the mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look confused. She didn't look fragile. She looked alert, awake in a way I hadn't been for months. I thought of my husband again, of the promises written in his careful handwriting, of the home he believed would protect me. Protection, I understood now, wasn't something you were given. It was something you reclaimed. When my son came home that evening, I asked him one question. "Did you give them my number?" He froze, just for a second. Then he nodded. "We thought it would help. To get information." Information. I smiled slightly. Not for him, for myself. "I appreciate you thinking ahead," I said. He relaxed instantly. That told me everything I needed to know. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook again. I wrote down the name of the facility, the date of the call, the words, short-term placement. Then I turned the page. They believed they were guiding me toward an ending. They hadn't considered that I might already be writing the next chapter. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my purse. Not hidden, accessible, ready. The house went quiet again as night fell. They slept easily, confident in the plans they had made without me. I lay awake, not rehearsing speeches, not imagining confrontations, just aligning pieces. Timing mattered now, and I was done waiting for permission. The 8th day was when I learned how invisible I had become. Not ignored, not forgotten, managed. That morning, I found a printed checklist on the kitchen counter. Not addressed to anyone, just there, typed, bullet points, dates next to them, doctor visit, paperwork, tour scheduled, no names, no explanations. I picked it up, read it once, and set it back exactly where it had been. I didn't tear it. I didn't hide it. I wanted it to stay where they expected it to be. They needed to believe I hadn't noticed. My daughter-in-law came in a few minutes later, glanced at the counter, and relaxed when she saw the paper untouched. She smiled at me the way people smile when a task is going according to plan. "You don't have to worry about any of this," she said. "We're handling it." "I know," I replied. That answer pleased her more than any argument ever could have. I spent the rest of the morning doing small, ordinary things. Folding laundry, wiping the kitchen table, watering the plant by the window that everyone else forgot needed water. Ordinary movements made people underestimate you. In the afternoon, my son left early. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. He believed things were moving forward without resistance. I waited until the house was empty. Then I went to my room, locked the door, and sat at the desk. I took out the papers from my purse and spread them neatly in front of me. Bank statements, account summaries, names that had quietly been added, names that had quietly been removed. I compared dates. Patterns don't hide forever. They just wait for someone patient enough to look. I wasn't rushing anymore. That was the mistake they had made. They assumed urgency would pressure me, that confusion would slow me down, that age would blur details. Instead, it sharpened them. I made a phone call, not to confront anyone, not to accuse, just to ask questions. The woman on the other end of the line answered professionally. She confirmed what could be confirmed. She avoided what couldn't. She didn't realize how much silence can reveal when you listen carefully. When the call ended, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. They moved before they asked. That evening, we ate dinner together. No one mentioned the checklist. No one mentioned the phone call from the facility. No one mentioned the word future. My daughter-in-law talked about grocery prices. My son talked about traffic. Ordinary conversation. Comfortable. They believed comfort meant control. I nodded at the right moments. I smiled when expected. I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. In my room, I turned off the light and sat in the dark. I thought about how many times I had stepped aside in my life so others could move forward. How often I had been patient because patience felt like love. This wasn't love. This was convenience. And convenience ends when it stops being useful. I lay down fully dressed, shoes still on, not to sleep but to think clearly. Sleep would come later. Planning came first. They thought the quiet meant surrender. They didn't understand that quiet was how I gathered strength. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to stay, on my terms. Outside my door, the house settled into its nighttime rhythm. Doors closed, lights turned off. A sense of completion filled the air. They believed the outcome was inevitable. I stared at the ceiling and counted my breaths, slow and steady. I had lived long enough to know this truth. People who rush you want something from you. People who underestimate you give you time. And time, when used well, changes everything. The 9th day arrived quietly. No calls, no checklists, no new instructions. That was when I knew something had shifted. I found the mail waiting on the entry table when I came downstairs, not stacked neatly the way my daughter-in-law preferred, just placed there, carelessly. My name was on one envelope. That hadn't happened in a while. I picked it up and turned it over slowly. Bank logo, official seal, addressed to me. Not care of, not shared, mine. I slipped it into my purse without opening it and made breakfast as usual. Toast, a hard-boiled egg, the kettle humming softly on the stove. Routine still mattered. It kept people from asking questions. When my daughter-in-law entered the kitchen, she glanced at the table. "Mail came early," she said. "Yes," I replied. She didn't ask what it was. She assumed, as she always had, that anything important would come to her first. That assumption was no longer true. Later that morning, I walked to the small park a few blocks away. I sat on the same bench I'd used for years, watching people pass with dogs and strollers. I opened the envelope there, away from the house. Inside was a statement. Numbers, dates, a summary I hadn't seen before. I read it once, then again. The balance wasn't what I expected. It was lower. Not by accident, not by fees. Transfers. Authorized transfers. I closed my eyes and let the air fill my lungs before opening them again. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected something sharper. What I felt instead was confirmation. I turned the page. There it was. A signature. Not mine. Not forged. Not sloppy. Clean. Confident. Someone had signed believing I would never look. I folded the statement carefully and placed it back in the envelope. On the walk home, I passed my neighbor Margaret's house. Her curtains were open. She was at the window watering plants. She saw me and waved. I waved back. I didn't stop. This wasn't something I needed to share yet. When I returned home, the house was empty. My son had gone out. My daughter-in-law's car was gone. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence. Then I went to the locked closet. I didn't force it. I didn't touch it. I went to my room and opened the small safe my husband and I had kept hidden behind old photo albums. I hadn't opened it since his death. Inside were documents I remembered, and some I didn't. Copies. He had made copies. Not everything. Just enough. I sat on the bed and laid them out. Property records, account details. A handwritten note tucked inside the last folder. If you're reading this, they've already started. I let that sit. No tears, no shock, just respect. He had known, not specifics, but the direction. That afternoon, my son came home earlier than usual. He looked surprised to see me in the living room. "I didn't know you were back," he said. "I wasn't out long," I replied. He nodded, uncomfortable. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the locked door. He didn't ask anything else. That evening, I placed the bank envelope on my nightstand. Not hidden, not opened again, just there. I wrote one line in my notebook. They assumed access meant permission. Then I closed it. I wasn't ready to speak, but the truth had stopped whispering. It was standing up now, and I was listening. The 10th day was about preparation. Not visible, not dramatic, just deliberate. I woke before sunrise and dressed in the dark. I didn't want the light on. Light attracts attention. Quiet work prefers shadows. I slipped my purse over my shoulder and left the house without making a sound. The streets were nearly empty. A delivery truck rumbled past. A jogger nodded at me and kept moving. I walked 3 blocks, then turned onto a street I hadn't taken in years. The building was old, brick exterior, narrow windows. The sign by the door was modest, almost easy to miss. I liked that. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. No television, no music, just the sound of pages turning and a clock marking time, honestly. When my name was called, I stood and followed the woman down the hallway. She didn't rush me. She didn't speak until we were seated. I placed the envelope on the desk between us. "I need to understand what I'm looking at," I said. She opened it carefully, as if aware that paper can carry weight. She read. Then she nodded once. "This explains some things," she said. I didn't respond. I watched her face instead. The way her eyes moved, the way her jaw set. We went through documents slowly. She asked questions. I answered only what was asked. I didn't fill the silence. Silence encourages accuracy. When she finished, she closed the folder and folded her hands. "You did the right thing by coming," she said. I nodded. That was all. When I left, the sky was brighter. Morning had fully arrived. I felt lighter, not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer unclear. On the way home, I stopped at the post office and rented a small box. My name only. No shared access. No explanations. Back at the house, my daughter-in-law was in the kitchen scrolling on her phone. She looked up briefly. "You were out early," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Doctor?" she asked. "No." That answer unsettled her. I saw it in the way she paused, the way she recalculated. "Oh," she said. "Well, breakfast is in the fridge." "Thank you." I ate alone. Later, my son asked if I had a moment. "About what?" I asked. "Just checking in," he said. "Making sure you're okay." I looked at him for a long second. "I am," I said. He smiled, relieved. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. He believed reassurance meant resolution. That afternoon, I moved a few things from my room into my purse. Not clothes, not personal items. Documents, addresses. A list I had started writing from memory and finished with certainty. I didn't hide what I was doing. I simply didn't announce it. That evening, the checklist was gone from the counter, replaced by nothing. That absence told me they believed the process was nearing completion. I sat in my room and reviewed everything one more time. Dates aligned. Names matched. Patterns repeated. There was nothing left to guess. I placed the papers back into my purse and set it by the door. Not packed. Positioned. I turned off the light and lay down, hands folded over my stomach, listening to the house breathe around me. They were confident. They thought momentum was on their side. They didn't realize momentum can change direction quietly. Tomorrow wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional. It would be precise. And for the first time since Mother's Day, I slept without interruption, because I knew exactly what I would do next. The 11th day arrived with an invitation. It was printed, formal, placed carefully on the kitchen counter where I would see it. My name typed correctly. The date circled in pen. Family meeting, it read. Saturday, 2 p.m. No location listed. They didn't need to list it. There was only one place they expected it to happen. I picked up the paper, read it once, and folded it in half. I didn't comment. I didn't acknowledge it. I placed it back where it had been. My daughter-in-law watched me from the sink, pretending to scrub a clean glass. You saw it? She asked. Yes, I said. That's good, she replied quickly. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. The same page. I nodded and walked away. Saturday came quietly. No tension in the air. No raised voices. My son went out in the morning and returned just before noon, dressed more carefully than usual. My daughter-in-law rearranged the living room furniture, moving chairs closer together, positioning herself where she always liked to sit, centered, in control. At 1:30, she brought out a folder and placed it on the coffee table. I noticed it was thicker than necessary. At 2 o'clock, they both sat down across from me. My son cleared his throat. We just want to talk, he said. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. My daughter-in-law opened the folder. Inside were forms, brochures, charts with smiling faces on glossy paper. This isn't about pushing you out, she said. It's about what's best. I didn't interrupt. She slid a brochure toward me. Assisted living, short-term care, community support. Words chosen carefully to soften the edges. We've already spoken to someone, my son added. They think it's a good fit. I looked at him then. Really looked. He couldn't meet my eyes. They talked for several minutes. About safety, about convenience, about peace of mind. Not once did they ask what I wanted. When they finished, the room went quiet. They waited for tears. They waited for resistance. They waited for gratitude. I reached into my purse and removed a single envelope. I placed it gently on the table, not opening it, not sliding it toward anyone. Just placing it there. I won't be going anywhere, I said. My voice was calm, not raised, not sharp. My daughter-in-law frowned. We're not deciding right now, she said quickly. We're just discussing options. I understand, I replied. My son shifted in his seat. Mom, I've already spoken to someone, I continued. They froze. Not completely, just enough. About what? My daughter-in-law asked. My accounts, I said. My records, my home. The word home landed heavier than anything else I could have said. She glanced at my son. He looked confused, alarmed. You didn't need to do that, he said. We were handling it. I know, I replied. I stood slowly, my joints stiff, but my balance steady. I appreciate the concern, I said. But this conversation is finished. They stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. I picked up the brochure and placed it back in the folder, closing it neatly. For now, I added. I walked down the hallway to my room and closed the door behind me. Not slammed, closed. From the other side, I could hear them whispering, recalculating, scrambling to adjust to a version of me they hadn't expected. I sat on the edge of the bed and removed the envelope from my purse again. I placed it on the dresser beside my husband's photo. The meeting they had planned hadn't gone the way they imagined. They thought this day would be about transition. They didn't realize it was about interruption. Their timeline, their assumptions, their certainty, all of it had been disrupted. And for the first time, the house felt unsteady. Not because of me, but because control had shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. The morning after the meeting, the house was quiet in a different way. Not tense, not hollow, resolved. I woke up before anyone else and made my bed, smoothing the blanket the way I always had. The sunlight through the window rested gently on the floor, catching dust in the air. Nothing had changed in the room. And yet, everything had. I dressed slowly and opened the door. In the kitchen, my daughter-in-law was already there, staring at her phone. She looked up when she heard me, then looked back down. No greeting, No instructions, no checklist. My son came in a few minutes later. He paused when he saw me, as if unsure what version of me he would find standing there. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied. We stood in the same space, but something invisible now separated us, not anger, awareness. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. No one joined me. No one asked questions. For the first time since Mother's Day, I wasn't waiting for a cue. Later that afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. Not theirs, mine. I watched from the window as it parked neatly at the curb. Margaret stepped out first, then the woman I had met days earlier. Calm, professional, purposeful. My daughter-in-law rushed to the door. My son followed close behind. "Mom?" he called, his voice uncertain. "What's going on?" I opened the door before he reached it. "I invited them," I said. They stood frozen as the women entered the house, greeting me politely. Papers were taken out. Chairs were moved. Not rearranged, reclaimed. No voices were raised. No accusations were spoken. Everything was handled with facts, with dates, with signatures, with clarity. I sat quietly while the truth settled into the room like dust after a long storm. When it was finished, the woman turned to me. "Do you have any questions?" "No," I said. I didn't need to look at my son to know what his face looked like. I didn't need to look at my daughter-in-law to see calculation failing her. They had planned carefully, just not carefully enough. By evening, the house felt lighter. Not because anything had been removed, but because something false had been lifted. I returned to my room and packed a small bag. Not to leave, to move, into the front bedroom, the one with more light, the one my husband used to read in. When I came out with the bag, my son stood in the hallway. "Mom," he said quietly. "We didn't mean to." I held up my hand. "I know," I said. "That's what hurts." He nodded once. He didn't argue. That night, I slept in the front room. The window was open. I could hear the street. Life moving forward, unconcerned with anyone's plans but its own. Before turning off the light, I placed my husband's photo on the nightstand. "You were right," I said softly. "This is still my home." In the weeks that followed, things adjusted, carefully. Respect returned, not loudly, not perfectly, but real enough to be felt. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't need them. What I needed was acknowledgement. And I had it. Mother's Day passed quietly the next year. No cards, no flowers. But that morning, I made coffee in my own kitchen, sat in my chosen chair, and watched the sunlight fall exactly where I wanted it. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't managed. I wasn't leaving. I had stayed. And in doing so, I had found myself again. If you've ever been told to pack your bags by the people you raised, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. Patience isn't surrender. And a woman who has lived a full life doesn't disappear just because someone wishes she would. She waits. And then she stands.